Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, we're going to be continuing from where we stopped. We created a custom user model that's going to allow us in our authentication. So we're going to go ahead and use this user model to use views so as to be able to create an endpoint for signing up our users. So to begin, we're going to begin by creating a serializer that's going to be responsible for creating our users. So I'm going to head over to our accounts app, and the first file I'll create is going to be our serializers.py. And within our serializers.py, we're going to create a model serializer that's going to help us to create a new user. So we're going to start by importing our serializers from Django framework. And after importing our serializers, we're also going to import our model. Right after importing our model, we're going to be able to create a class that's going to define our model serializer. So we're going to call this the sign up serializer. And this is going to inherit from our serializers.model serializer. Right after doing this, we're going to define a meta class that's going to describe the model as well as the fields that are going to exist on our serializer. So we're going to do that with class meta, and then we shall define a model. That model is going to be our user model. Then on that model, we shall define a list of fields that we want from this model. So we're going to need the email. We're also going to need our username, and also going to need our password. Now, for us to be able to add some validation onto this list of fields, we're going to need to describe each of the fields we want. So we're going to begin with our email right here, and we're going to be describing these fields using serializer fields. So I'm just going to come and say this is going to be serializers.char field, and then we're going to specify the max length. So the max length in this case is going to be 80 characters. And then I'm going to also provide our username. So in this case, we shall have our username as serializers.char field, and then we shall have our max length being equal to 45. Now we're also going to do the same thing for our password. So our password is going to be equal to char field 2. So in this case, we're going to come and say it's going to be serializer.char field. Then in here, we're going to have a min length. So let's say that we need to have the minimum password having a length of 8 characters. And we're also going to add another extra attribute that's going to allow us to keep this field as one for editing only. So we want to keep our password private and not accessible to anyone outside our app. So we shall just add this. It's going to be write only, and this will be equal to true. Now, right after doing this, this is actually supposed to be true. And once I do that, I'm going to go ahead and save. Now, another thing we're going to be doing is to create validations that are going to check whether our user exists in our database. So I'll have to enlarge this a little bit. So I'll have to add another method. This method is going to be called the validate method, and this is going to be responsible for carrying out such validations. For each time we create a user, we're going to need to check if the email of this user exists in our database. Since we specified on our model that we have the unique attribute equal to true. So to do that, I'm going to begin by querying for our database and checking whether this user exists. So we're going to write our query here, which is going to be email exists, and this will be equal to. So we're going to query for our users. So I'm just going to come and say user.objects. In this case, we're going to filter, and we shall filter by the email. So in this case, if the email is equal to, so we provided a dictionary of attributes, so we shall access the email by using the key of email. This is actually going to be attributes, and then we shall basically call that dot exists. It's actually going to be dot exists, and this is supposed to return a true or false value in case this email exists or not. Now, after doing that, I'm simply going to come and write an if statement here. So shall come and say if email exists, we shall raise a validation error telling the user that this email actually exists. So to do that, I'm going to be using REST Framework's validation error class. So I'll just come and say raise, and then we shall have validation error. So I'm going to be importing this. So this will be validation error. And I'll come at the top right here, and all I have to do is to remove this, and I'll come and import this from REST Framework dot validators. We shall go ahead and import our validation error class. So right after importing this validation error class, now we're going to provide a message. So in this case, we're going to just come and say that the email has already been used. And right after doing this, I'm going to go ahead and save. So let's build views let's build actually a view that's going to allow us to create a user using our defined serializer. So I'm going to go within our views.py in our accounts app still, and all I have to do is to open that file up. So the first thing we're going to do is to import our serializer. So I'll just come right here at the top and say from .serializers, we're going to import our sign up serializer. And right after doing that, I'm going to import our generics module from Django REST Framework, since we're going to use a generic API view to define this view. So I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is to say from REST Framework. In this case, I'll just come and say we're going to import our generics. We shall also need our status codes. We're also going to need our response objects as well as our response objects. So I'll just come and say from REST Framework dot, in this case, we're going to access the response module. Shall import our response. We're also going to need our request object. So I'll just have to import our request class. So in this case, it's going to be from .request. We shall go ahead and import our request. Now, this is enough for us to go. So I'm just going to come right here, and I'll define a class. This is going to be our sign up view. So let me just call it our sign up view, and this is going to inherit from our generics.generic API view. Now after doing this, we are going to define our first attribute in this class as our serializer class, and this is going to be equal to our sign up serializer. After doing this, we're going to define the method that's going to be called with this post request. So just come and mention that to be our post method, and this is going to take in self. It's going to also take in a request. So this request is going to be of type request. And right after doing this, then the first thing we're going to do is to get the data that's going to come from our JSON, or the data that's actually going to come with this request. So I'll create a variable called data, and this is going to be equal to our request data. So shall just come and access that data from our request object. So I'll just come and say that we shall have this as our request data. And after having this as our request data, now we need to pass this data into our serializer so that we go ahead and carry out our validations as well as save our user in the database. So I'm going to do this by creating a serializer object, and this is going to be an instance of our serializer class. Now the thing I'm going to do here is to provide our data as the data that we got from our post request. Now just come and say that our data is going to be equal to our data, and the next thing we shall do is to check if this is actually valid. So what I'll do is to say if serializer dot is valid. In this case, we're going to come and say serializer dot save. And right after saving this serializer, we are going to return a response. So I'm just going to come and return a response object. So I'm going to create an instance of our response class and shall provide the data. So right here, I'm going to actually create a custom response that we shall return. And this is going to be a dictionary. It's going to contain a message showing us that our user has been created. So in this case, we shall just come and say user created successfully. And in this case, what I have to do is to also provide the data of the user. So in this case, we expect that our password is hashed and hidden, as we describe this to be a write-only field. So I'll just come and say that the data is going to be our serializer data. So I'll just come and say serializer dot data And in this case, what I have to do is to provide that data as our response. And then we shall have our status. So since we imported our status, we're going to actually have access to the status code. So I'll just specify that this is going to be status dot. So in this case, we shall have .http 201 created. And then if we have any errors, we're going to return them via serializer.errors. So I'll just come and write another line of code in this, in case this if statement has failed to pass, we shall return. So in this case, we shall just come and say return response, and then in this case, we shall have our data being equal to our serializer dot data, and then we shall also have our status being the status code for a bad request. So in this case, it's going to be status dot http 400 bad request. So when I go ahead and save this, let us go ahead and create a URL that's going to allow us to create a user using this view. So I'm going to go within our accounts app still, and I'm going to create a new module or file. This is going to be our urls.py file. Now within this urls.py file, the first thing I have to import are going to be our views. So I'll just come and say from dot, we are going to import our views module, and then we're going to go ahead and briefly import the path function from Django. So I'm just going to come and say from Django dot urls, we are going to import our path function. So once we've imported this path function, we're going to create a list of URL patterns for our accounts app. Now I'm just simply going to come here and say that we're going to have our URL patterns, and inside here we're going to create our first URL pattern as a pattern for our sign up route. Now we shall call this URL sign up, and then we're going to attach it to a view. So I'll just come right here and say that we shall have our view being equal to our sign up view. It's actually going to be from our views module. It's actually going to be a sign up view. Then we shall have to call the .asView function. Then in this case, we shall provide it a name, and this name is going to be sign up. Now after doing this, then what we shall need in this case is to go ahead and attach our account URLs into our main project URLs. So to do that, I'm simply going to come right here, and all I have to do is to go to our simple blog project folder right here, and within our URLs here, what I have to do is the same thing we did for our posts app. I'll just come and define a new URL configuration, and this is going to be for our, so I'm going to call this endpoint /auth, and then we shall have to include all URLs that are from our accounts app. So I'm just going to come and say include accounts.urls. Now right after doing this, I'm going to go ahead and save. Now let's try to test out this endpoint. When I pull up our terminal is still running, and I'll go to our Insomnia right here. So within our Insomnia, I'm going to create a new request. So I'm going to give this request a name. It's going to be the request for creating a user account or signing up. So this is going to be a post request, and we shall need to provide the body of this request or the payload as JSON. Now we're going to go ahead and create this request. So I'll come and first provide our URL. Our URL is going to be localhost 8000, and in this case we shall access this via the auth endpoint, and then this is going to be via sign up. So let's provide our data. So I'm just going to come and provide data for a user who is existing. So I'll just come and first provide our email. So let's start with our email. Our email is going to be admin@app.com, and then we shall have our username. So in this case, our username is going to be admin, and we shall also have our password. So we shall have our password, and in this case, our password is going to be password 123. So when you have this, I'm going to try to send this request, and now we see that our user has actually been created. So we actually have a bad request. It seems like we did not return the errors. So when I go back within our views, seems like we return the data instead of returning the errors. Sorry for this mistake. So I'm just simply going to come and say, going to access the errors. And then when you go back here, when you try to send, in this case, we see that we have our errors. So one thing that you can observe is that the Django REST framework is going to actually return for us errors, but it's going to provide for us non-filled errors. So if you want to customize this and change it to what you want, we are going to set it up in our settings.py within our REST framework settings. So what I'm going to do is to go within our settings.py, and that is within our simple blog project right here. So I'll head over to our settings.py, and I'm going to create a dictionary for our Django REST framework settings. So I'm just going to come here and I'll call that dictionary REST framework, and this will be a dictionary. So it's going to have a bunch of settings, as you're going to see. Now, the first setting we're going to set for this is going to be our non-filled errors key. So this is actually going to be for that key of that specific error. So I'll just come and say non-filled errors, and then we shall provide key. So this is going to be our key, and in this case we're going to change this key to simply errors. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Our server is going to restart. And when I head over to our Insomnia right here and we try to sign up a user, we now see that we are being returned a key of errors. Alright, so it seems like our validation is working for now. So let's also try to create a user with a password that's short. So let me try creating a password of 3 characters. Now in this case, we see that we're actually getting validation for that, which is actually working also fine. So let's try to also create a user for credentials that do not exist in our database. So I'm just going to come right here and provide a user. So I'm just going to call this user John Doe, and then we shall also call this user John Doe. So we shall keep the password the same. When you try to sign up, in this case, we see that our user has been created successfully. So when you go back to our admin section right here, I'm going to refresh. And right now we see that our user with the username of John Doe has been created. So when you try to view this user right here, we see that the user has been created and all the information we've specified for this user has been generated. But we have one problem still, and our problem is we've been able to create this user, but our password has not been hashed. Now, I've been landing into this problem a lot of times, and I hope you've also landed into it when creating a custom user. But we're going to be able to solve it in a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is to delete this user. So I'm going to come and delete this user. And right after deleting this user, I'm going to head over to our serializer that we used to create our user. So that's within our, so I'm just going to head over to our serializers within our accounts app. And then we're going to basically override our create method. So the create method is one that's run each time we call the .save method on our instances when using our serializer to save our objects. So we're going to be able to override that and dictate how we're going to set the user's password. So I'm just going to come right here, and all I have to do is def. In this case, I'm going to override the create method. So this is going to take in the validated data, and that validated data is going to be a list of all the fields. So it's actually going to contain the data that we pass in and have validated. So the first thing we shall need access to is going to be the password that we've passed in via signing up. So I'll just come right here, and all I have to do is password. And in this case, we're going to access this via our validated data. So I'll use the pop function to basically pop out the password or remove the password, so that we actually have this variable contain the password that we passed in. And in this case, I'll just come and say that this is going to be our password. Now, this function returns super.create validated data, and this is basically the result of the object that we create via this create method, and in this case it's actually our user. So what I have to do is to copy or cut this, and then this is actually going to be our user. So I'm just going to come and say we're going to have our user being equal to this, and right after doing that, we are now going to call the set password method. Now if you're confused, the set password method is being called right here on our models, but it's not actually going ahead to hash our password. So I'm using the create method on our serializer to go ahead and do that. This actually works in case we are creating a super user via our command line, but it's failing to work when we are creating our user via our serializer. So right now I'm using our create method to do that. So right now what I'm going to actually do is to say user dot, in this case I'll call the set password method, and when I call this, I'm just simply going to call our password. And right after doing this, we are finally going to go ahead and save our user. So this actually updates the password and hashes it. And after that, we shall just simply come and say user.save, basically saving it to our database. And then we shall come and return our user. So I'm going to go ahead and save, hoping that our server is still running and everything is fine, no issues. So what I have to do is to go ahead and create us user again. So I'm going to head over to our Insomnia right here, and when I send this request, we now see that our user has been created. Now let's check if the user's password has actually been hashed. I'll head over back to our admin section right here and refresh. So in this case, we have our user called John Doe. And in this case, we have all the other attributes. We have defined our email, our username, as well as our password that has been hashed successfully. In this video, we've been able to create our user or sign up our user or create a user account for our user using credentials such as our email, our username, and our password. In the next video, we're going to be handling other forms of authentication. We shall be looking into how to log in a user, and I hope you follow along. If you like this video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I hope you learned from this video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.